Hi, I'm Festus Maiginap. Welcome to this edition of Business PNG. In this episode, we take a look at the necessity of having banks and financial institutions operate under proper risk management guidelines, some of the common risks faced by BSP and ANZ banks in Papua New Guinea, the state of liquid assets since the month of March this year, and a summary of the country's 2012 revised economic outlook. But first, to conduct any banking business, banks or financial institutions will have to design proper operational strategies to account for risk in order to realize returns on their investments, as risk assumed can wipe out expected returns and result in loss to the institutions. To emphasize this fact, the Papua New Guinea Institute of Banking and Business Management, IBBM, organized a seminar in Port Moresby on the 4th of July this year.
A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests. PNG IBBM is greatly honored to host the second banking seminar in 2012 today and welcome you all on the risk management seminar.
The Papua New Guinea Institute of Banking and Business Management, IBBM, conducted a risk management seminar on effective compliance and risk mitigation and control in Port Moresby recently at the Gateway Hotel. Risk managers from lending banks and financial institutions operating in Papua New Guinea attended the seminar, one that featured prominent speakers such as the PNG Central Bank Governor Loy Bakani and Dr. R. Bhaskaran, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the Indian Institute of Banking and Finance.
Indeed, compared to any other country, this has a very high liquidity position. The real estate is booming. Everywhere the prices are going up and so are the buildings. Every time you land, you find some 2-3 new buildings have come up. The country is growing very fast.
The seminar was aimed at creating awareness and emphasizing the need for better risk management in the banking and associated payments infrastructure. IBBM Executive Director Sweta Sood said the need for effective risk management framework in the banking business can't be overemphasized.
And that is what the risk seminar today will talk about. How to maintain continuity. We will be touching upon very critical topics of compliance, regulation, risk mitigation, risk control, best practices in risk, anti-money laundering, and by the close of the seminar, I will sum up in what risk means to a PNG business owner.
Risk management can be defined in many ways. This is what the other participants in the seminar had to say.
This is considered to be more risk-focused. The bank recognized that supervision practice is not on a one-size-fits-all approach, but instead institutions should be regulated on its systematic importance.
It's not that risks are mutually independent. All are interconnected. One will lead to the other. I don't think if you have an operational risk or reputational risk, the legal risk will not be involved. It's only saying that the following risks are possible, but I have not seen one risk coming alone. A reputation risk invariably will follow with the legal risk. The losses for the organizations could be much higher because we don't understand how the legal system. Bank is expected to protect the money of its client. Bank is expected to protect the knowledge and the information of its client. It should not be known outside.
Through an effective risk management framework, institutions can be able to enhance returns on their investment while monitoring and responding to operational risk controls. The central bank has the regulatory role to ensure all licensed financial institutions comply with the terms of risk management, credit and market risks. Governor Bakani said the most important thing is to have prudent management and likewise the license to comply with these risks outlined with institutional policy and documentation with board and management to handle financial risk.
At the end of March 2012, the banks in Papua New Guinea maintain adequate capital levels despite the general decrease in indicator ratios. Total capital to risk weighted assets increased to 30.2% at the end of March this year from 28% at the end of December 2011. Total capital as a percentage of total assets increased to 12% at the end of March this year from 11% last year in December.
The seminar provided an avenue where risk managers and senior officials from financial institutions converged to discuss and understand risks involved in the banking business, learn from past experiences, and more importantly, prepare for future probabilities. Do stay with us. Coming up after the break, we take a look at the risk operations for BSP and ANZ banks as presented in the IBBM seminar. In the course of conducting business, banks and financial institutions assume risks in order to realize returns on their investments. Inversely, risks assumed have the potential to wipe out expected returns and may result in losses to the institution. These losses could be either expected or unexpected. In this segment, we take a look at some of the risk management strategies of BSP and ANZ banks. Risk is a discipline at the core of every banking business and incorporates all activities that affect its risk profile. Like anywhere in the world today, banks introduce risks into their operations through foolish management practices. However, the PNG Central Bank reports that banks operating in the country are risk-aware and have put in place necessary risk mitigation controls. Banks have generally achieved the various stages of defining, implementing and enforcing some risk framework to ensure that it is appropriate with the scope and complexity of its operations.
How to establish operational risk in your institution. My presentation today doesn't necessarily cover what the banks have done. It's as a minimum requirement for you as a non-banking entity can implement.
The risk management seminar organized by the Papua New Guinea Institute of Banking and Business Management, IBBM, was a venue for presentations and open discussions.
Risk and control assessment is a process for identifying, assessing, responding to and monitoring operational risk and controls.
It is understood that there are three major risks faced by banks: operational, market and financial risks. Regulators, however, also look at and expect banks to address strategic, regulatory, liquidity, operational, market, foreign exchange and credit or default risks. Risk operations managers for two of the country's commercial lending banks, BSP and ANZ, availed this opportunity to present their risk operation strategies.
I've mentioned culture change and risk awareness. In any given implementation, this is by far the hardest thing to get right, okay? Because you're changing the culture of the bank, changing the mindsets of the people within the bank. And lastly, long-term goals for operational risk.
You may have heard of a document called a BEICF, a BEICF. Again, on Google, you can find plenty of references to these. If you go onto the APRA website, you'll find some good articles on BEICF. It's about establishing the context of your business.
Key operational risks broadly fit into different categories. However, like any banking business, internal fraud is the #1 threat for banks.
The fraud risk, it requires a lot of vigilance on the part of our people to detect fraudulent checks, particularly check fraud. ANZ is investing in new technology to help us combat check fraud by identifying counterfeit checks, etc. and implementing lots of controls to detect these fraudulent checks before they cause any financial damage to us.
Being the largest bank in the Pacific, the number of transactions that come through to BSP is quite intensive. Therefore, we see a fair amount of check fraud coming into our organisation. However, we've taken a number of steps to reduce that. For example, we have reduced or stopped special answers. So checks are processed now as part of normal 4 or 5 day check processing time. We no longer accept fast clearances. That's one way to alleviate that risk. Secondly, we've introduced check scanners.
Even regulators have fraud issues to deal with. The central bank indicated that apart from the problem of having a thin financial market causing difficulty in raising capital domestically, high security and risks do exist.
Thirdly, high security and fraud risk. of course, comes at a cost, exists in this country, where violence and crime are a real problem. And this is, and where utilities are unreliable and robust contingency planning against business disruption is very essential part of ongoing day-to-day business.
The Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of the Indian Institute of Banking and Finance, Dr. R. Bhaskaran, in his presentation stressed the need for banks to have better risk management practices in accordance to the ever-evolving risk functions.
Bank is risk management. When you accept deposits from the public, you are promising them to return the money safely with a fixed rate of interest. You are taking a risk because you are investing it in credit, in market, in loans and others. You may or you may not get the money. So you are having a risk when you accept money from many people and putting it in one people. Or you take the risk second way, you accept short-term money and put it in long-term investments. Or you accept the risk in the third way, you accept money which is safe and deposit and put it in the market for investments. Everything that a bank does, forget bank which is aggressive, forget bank which says I am the best. Any bank has to take a risk for surviving.
Meanwhile, both BSP and ANZ banks reported sound operations amidst the thriving economic growth in recent years. There have been expansions in their businesses, including the inclusion of innovative banking systems to meet customer demand.
PNG is a very important business for ANZ, and where there's opportunities to open new branches, we will do it.
The economy in general has seen a favourable and steady climb in recent years. This means that liquid assets for banks have been high. We'll have that story after the break. If you've just joined us, you're watching Business PNG. As reported by the Bank of Papua New Guinea, commercial banks have been experiencing high liquidity and continue to do so, with ratio of liquid assets to total deposits taking on an upward turn since December last year. The Governor of Bank of Papua New Guinea says the economic ratios indicate that the system is sound as there are sufficient liquid assets to continue lending activities and meet short-term obligations in their normal course of business. Reports and analysis indicate that the global financial crisis has placed liquidity risk management front and center in the global banking industry. Liquidity is now a major focus for regulators. This means that global banks must navigate a range of regulatory requirements and guidance. Papua New Guinea, like most countries in the Asia-Pacific region, continues to outperform the rest of the world even as the European sovereign debt crisis and weak growth in the US pose external challenges.
I think one of the key reasons is that we are isolated from the major financial institutions. So therefore, the flow of that risk contagion from Europe or America to PNG is fairly limited.
As such, Asia Pacific doesn't show of any high risk because the Asia Pacific comes under the Australian group and banking systems are very strong here, and credit risk is very low, and market is not fully developed, so you don't have any risky investments like futures, options and CDS taking place.
Pressure on central banks to intervene is growing amidst mounting evidence that the Eurozone debt crisis is affecting major economies, including the US and China.
It is pleasing to note that the Bank of Papua New Guinea is one step ahead as the leverage ratio forms part of its minimum capital requirements. At the end of March 2012, the banks in Papua New Guinea maintain adequate capital levels despite a general decrease in indicator ratios. Total capital to risk-weighted assets increased to 30.2% at the end of March this year, from 28% at the end of December 2011. Total capital as a percentage of total assets increased to 12% at the end of March this year, from 11% last year.
One of the central bank's objectives is to ensure that all banks have sufficient liquidity to meet obligations. PNG Bank Governor Loy Bakani says institutions are particularly vulnerable to sudden and unexpected demand for funds, which may have significant implications for the other institutions and for the financial system as a whole.
The onus is on the board, again, stressing the board, to ensure that they are apprised for key liquidity risk issues arising within the bank, and that these are well understood and addressed in a timely manner. It is their responsibility to understand the nature, complexities, and the level of liquidity risk assumed by the bank, including the tools used to manage liquidity risk through the establishment of a prudent liquidity management framework.
Central Bank has announced high liquidity for banks operating in the country. The ratio of liquid assets to total deposits increased to 73.9% by March this year, compared to 73.2% in December last year. Total loans to total deposits decreased to 46.9% by the end of March, a 1.4% difference from last December's 48.3% record.
The ratios indicate that the system is very sound, as there are sufficient liquid assets to continue lending activities, pay customer withdrawals, and meet short-term obligations in the normal course of business. As the system is highly liquid, the Bank of Papua New Guinea cash reserve requirement is at the moment at 8%.
For the commercial banks, high liquidity means that there's a lot of capital. This usually happens when interest rates are low, and so capital is easily available. Low interest rates mean credit is cheap, which reduces the risk of borrowing. That's because the return only has to be higher than the interest rate, so more investments look good. In this way, high liquidity spurs economic growth.
The capital adequacy is being maintained at 32% and all that. That shows that there is a lot of fund available as of now, but the credit offtake and others are poor. So the banks will now try to expand credit and try to make a better earning for them.
Meanwhile, the central bank reported that Papua New Guinea will continue to experience high economic growth throughout the year due to significant domestic activities associated with the ongoing construction of the multi-billion Kina LNG project and a general peak in private sector investments. These developments have benefited some sectors of the economy, such as building and construction, manufacturing, transportation, and commerce sectors. Join me after the break to see what the Asian Development Bank had to say in terms of the country's revised economic outlook in 2012. Welcome back, viewers, to Business PNG. The Port Moresby Chamber of Commerce and Industry organized a chamber breakfast on the 18th of July this year, where the Asian Development Bank's country economists, Aaron Button, presented the country's revised economic update for 2012. Here's the Chief Executive Officer for the Port Moresby Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dave Korn, who had a chat with Mr. Button about this presentation.
As usual, I would say a very challenging presentation, looking at the economic outlook for PNG. What was your main message that you were trying to get across today?
I think some of the main messages were that the PNG economy remains fundamentally very strong. Business optimism has been growing very strongly, and when we're seeing that in these sort of business surveys that are coming out recently, showing very strong plans for future capital investment. But the other key message was this issue around the changing sources of PNG's growth, and that there's going to be a shift in the type of growth that PNG records from the non-mineral sector over to the mineral sector, as many of these new mines.
Isn't that a good message, though? I mean, to widen that base of our economy? Yeah.
The input of the mining sector into the PNG economy will have a number of benefits. It will generate some revenue for government, and as the construction phase is undertaking, it's generating employment. But the non-mineral sector that we've seen with the growth in the services sector, transport, telecommunications, finance, wholesale and retail trade, has been generating very large employment gains for the people of PNG.
Yeah, some of that increase was quite meteoric, especially the communications, for example. And I mean, that's a challenge to keep that employment growing. I mean, is that something we're going to see in the longer term, or we're going to see that tailing off?
Well, I think, yes, you're right that the growth in PNG's employment figures have been very impressive over the last 5 to 6 years. The total size of the private sector has more than doubled. And in the last 12 months, private sector employment has increased by over 16%,
Yes,
which is
that's-
meteoric by international standards. But you're right, as the growth shifts from the non-mineral economy and these services sectors like construction and telecommunications, and as their expansion winds down, and as the size of the mining sector increases, we're going to see a tailing off in that employment growth for the economy.
You mentioned an issue of inflation. We always toy with this, or we don't toy with it, we always struggle with this issue of what real rates of inflation were. What's your take on that?
Well, the higher Kina exchange rate that we've seen over the last 12 months has had a very important impact on bringing down the levels of inflation. The official figures are saying that the level of price growth on an annual basis is now at about 4%. Our sort of alternative indicators of that price growth probably put it at somewhere closer to 6 to 7% on an annualised basis.
I think you'd find our businesses might be agreeing with you there, if that. Yeah. Okay. Exchange rates, have they peaked, or we still got some growth to go there?
Well, as I mentioned, the exchange rate has gone up quite significantly over the last 12 months by 30% against the US and the Australian dollars. But we are likely to see a moderation in that growth, and if not a decline over the next 12 to 24 months. We have declining commodity export revenues and a slowing down of foreign direct investment into the country, which will lower the demand for the Kina.
How much of a challenge is that, the decline in these export revenues? I mean, we did do this before. We talked about rather optimistic forecasts in the budget, and in many ways that's come to pass. Is that something where we can still see that these rates are going to drop? And
Well, the main impact of the decline in the commodity prices is really going to be on the government revenue side, and we're seeing that with recent announcements about a budget deficit for this year, somewhere in the range of 500 million Kina, but I think they're still reviewing the situation. The commodity prices for this year have remained well below the budget forecasts, and so that is, of course, creating significant fiscal pressures.
This issue of deficit, 500 million, it's for some people a scary figure. PNG can handle that?
I think over the short term, over the next sort of 2 to 3 years, running a budget deficit is not necessarily a bad thing for PNG. The government is expecting future strong revenue growth out into the longer term. So being able to maintain its level of expenditure over the next 2 to 3 years by having a budget deficit and borrowing a small amount of money is quite prudent.
Will the borrowing be domestic, I assume?
The government will borrow primarily for its budget deficit from the domestic financial sector, which is, of course, it's very highly liquid at the moment, so it shouldn't have too much of a trouble doing that.
Is there an impact for business there? I mean, soaking up that liquidity that's not available to business?
I mean, the availability of finance to business is very high at the moment. There is a lot of surplus liquidity in the financial sector, so it shouldn't have much of a pass-through over the short term. But having said that, if there is continued budget deficits over a long term, then that could have a negative impact on the availability of finance.
But we have a couple of years we could survive.
We have a significant amount of time before that happens.
We're not going to say too many years. Obviously, we're looking at this time as in a new government coming in, and businesses will have some messages for a new government. What would you like to think we would say to a new government?
I think on the one hand there is a very big need for a greater level of fiscal austerity over this period. They can borrow, but that borrowing should remain moderate and be very careful not to encourage inflationary pressures in the economy. Fundamentally though, the government needs to look for ways to promote growth in the non-mineral economy. So how to promote the economy outside of the mining sector. And this is what will lead to further improvements in employment growth and really benefit the people of PNG.
And then there is, of course, we've talked about it earlier, there's still a challenge in the agriculture area that, I mean, commodity prices are dropping as well. I noticed in one of your graphs. So that impacts strongly in the rural economies in terms of employment?
We probably will see a decline in rural incomes for this year. The employment figures should remain quite stable, but there will be less money going into the rural areas as a result of these declining commodity prices. As a result though, I mean, still though, the price of commodities is still high by sort of global and traditional standards, so the revenues going in are still quite significant.
Yeah. In closing, I said at the presentation, I didn't have a real warm, fuzzy feeling about how things are going. Would that be wrong?
I think overall the PNG economic picture is very positive. There's a lot of optimism within the business community, and future business investment looks like it will be strong. Some of those expectations will probably moderate over the next couple of years and set on probably a more sustainable growth path. PNG is likely to grow by 9 or 10% this year.
Yeah.
Next year that will moderate, but it will still be strong and business conditions will remain good.
Yeah. And the impact of the that's clearly an impact of LNG on the economy. Is there an impact as construction finishes and employment dwindles? Is there likely to be a gap before we see significant revenues coming through?
So the LNG project is expected to peak its construction phase later this year, I believe.
Okay.
And then over the next period between 2013 and 2014, that activity will wind down. And that, of course, will have a slowing effect on the economy as some of those workers are released back into the economy.
Yes, yeah.
And then from 2014 again is when the export starts, when we'll see a very significant GDP boost.
Okay. But the significant revenues we won't see 2000.
Won't come in until later in the decade, probably closer to 2020. Yeah.
Okay, that's and the possibility of other projects, that was something you haven't factored in yet. Following on from this Exxon project.
Yeah, I mean there is a large prospect of future projects they're talking about.
You haven't factored it into
they're not in the current growth projections given the uncertainty surrounding them at the moment.
Okay. Something economists don't.
Like uncertainty.
You don't like uncertainty as an economist. Aaron, thank you very much. As usual, a very challenging presentation.
Well, viewers, hope this episode was educational. Do tune in next Tuesday at the same time for another edition of Business PNG. Until then, I'm Festus Maiganap. Bye for now.